One of the most powerful government offices you've never heard of, OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, responsible for review of government regulations, costs, benefits, unintended consequences. We're going inside OIRA, plus President Trump's regulatory reform agenda. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. From 2007 through January of 2009, under President George W. Bush, Susan Dudley served as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is a part of the Office of Management and Budget, better known as OMB. Currently, Professor Dudley is the director of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. She's distinguished professor of practice in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And I'm a big fan of GW. As I've told her, my daughter graduated in 2007 when President Trachtenberg was still in office. And Susan has promised to make OIRA sexy this morning. How are you?
Great. Great to be on the show with you, Jim.
It's our honor. As we said, this is the most important office you've never heard of, known as the Regulatory Czar. Tell us exactly what the function is and why it's so important.
Its function is to review not only regulations, but also any information requests that the government might have of citizens, statistics across the government, and they also coordinate internationally with other regulators overseas. And of course, in Canada and Mexico. It's important because maybe I should just back up and just quickly explain what regulations are. The legislative branch, of course, passes laws. So our elected officials pass the laws, but those laws delegate to regulatory agencies like the Department of Homeland Security or Transportation Security Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration. They delegate responsibility for implementing those laws through regulations to those agencies. And it is those regulations that this office, OIRA, oversees.
Essentially, it goes from Congress to the agencies, and then it has to go through OIRA, right, for a more neutral, dispassionate view of the impact.
Yes. So OIRA is like other parts of OMB. OMB's it has responsibilities for the budget. So OMB obviously coordinates the budget of each agency, and so no agency can go directly to Congress and say this is the budget they would like. They go through OMB, and it's coordinated. The management and performance of agencies is coordinated through the on the management side of OMB. All legislative opinions, et cetera, also go through the OMB. So OIRA's role is like that of those other offices within OMB. It's to coordinate across the agencies, and as you said, and that was actually a phrase of President Obama's, that it provides a dispassionate and analytical second opinion on the agency's actions.
Is it required that the net benefits exceed the costs, or is that a hope?
That's a great question. So OIRA was actually formed in 1981, or actually it was created by the Paperwork Reduction Act signed by President Jimmy Carter in 1980. And its function under the Act, so its legislative function, is to make sure that anytime the agencies or government agencies and departments request information from the public, that this office checks them and makes sure that it's necessary, not duplicative, and the least burdensome necessary. So, for example, on your tax forms, or anytime you fill out a form for the government, you'll see there's a little OMB number, and if it doesn't have that number, you don't actually have to fill out that form. That's what the office was created for. That President Reagan, when he came into office in 1981, also added this new function, and that is to review all the draft regulations from the executive branch agencies. And in that review, he required them to do analysis, the agencies to conduct analysis to understand what the effects would be, regulatory impact analysis, including the benefits and the costs and an evaluation of different alternative ways of approaching it. These were requirements that previous presidents, Carter and even Nixon before him, had generally, but they didn't have this review mechanism to enforce them. President Clinton in 1993 changed some of the terms of it, but essentially kept those requirements the same. So it is that net benefit test. Let's look at every regulation, and especially for the bigger ones, the higher impact regulations, make sure that they provide more benefits than cost, or essentially do more good than harm.
I'm impressed, too, that both Republican and Democratic presidents have stuck with this on either side. Let me ask you this, lest we think this isn't that big a deal. I think you estimated that regulations cost $2 trillion. Is that a year or over 10-year period or something? But it's really a hidden tax.
Yes, people often call it a hidden tax because it is something that, unlike the on-budget, the cost of on-budget programs, we see that in the fiscal budget, we see it in our taxes, but regulations affect the price of goods and services, the salaries that you can get, and even what kinds of things that are available. And so it is hidden. That's actually, that $2 trillion is not my own estimate. I think it's so hard to do that we have not tried to estimate the cost. That is actually originally from the Small Business Administration, more recently updated by the National Association of Manufacturers using academics Mark and Nicole Crane. Another study done by the Mercatus Center, Bentley Coffey and Patrick McLaughlin, actually estimates $4 trillion a year.
Wow.
So they use different methods, and it's hard.
That's very hard. By the way, $4 trillion would be the entire size of the federal budget, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
So it's like a double budget. Geez. Tell us, Susan, what you were administrator under the George W. Bush administration. I guess Josh Bolton would have been the OMB, would have been your boss, I guess, and then he was chief of staff. What was your focus then? What kind of an impact do you think you made?
I was the administrator in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, and my focus was mostly on wrapping up priorities and trying to ensure that we didn't issue too many midnight regulations. So there's this phenomena that you can document back to at least the 60s, that presidents at the end, the last few months of their term, especially after Election Day in their final year, there's a rapid uptick in regulatory activity if they try to hurry and finish their priorities. And I came in with 2 years left and tried to smooth that out and say, if we have priorities, focus on them now. I really don't want us to be issuing last-minute regulations that kind of tries to lock in the next president. And you asked me how successful I was?
Sure.
Not very.
But I think your stats, to be you're modest, your stats did show that they've gone down, the midnight regs, since then, right? Am I right on that? Or
I think we were somewhat successful in that we spread it out a little bit over the last year. So if you look at the post-election quarter between Election Day and when President Obama was inaugurated, there were way fewer regulations than the previous transition. But if you look over the year, in part, they were just spread longer over the year, which isn't a total failure, because I think that meant there was more methodical opportunity for evaluation. For the public had plenty of opportunity to comment and evaluate the regulations before they were put in place.
Since the function's looking across the government as opposed to all the silos, do you view yourself as taking on the special interests?
Yes. I think that's a key function of OIRA and the other parts of OMB. They have that cross-cutting perspective so they can see the bigger picture and all the competing priorities for government resources. So I think a key role of OIRA is countering that tunnel vision and the influence of special interests. In
terms of bureaucracy, how long is it take OIRA to get one of these things through their system, approved or not approved, and out the door? On average,
OIRA review takes 60 days. Sometimes it's much quicker, and other times it can be very long. So that average can hide some reviews that last a year or even more. But in terms of the process from start to finish of the regulation, not just OIRA's part, that's at least a year, because agencies do have to, they do some analysis, they develop their proposal with documentation on why, and then they have the OIRA review, which isn't just the OMB office reviewing. It is one of the things OIRA does is coordinate across government agencies. So agencies get to see each other's regulation, and it does help make sure that there isn't conflict or duplication. And then they need to seek public comment. So in the U.S., all regulations must go through public notice and comment, and then agencies have to respond to that public comment and develop a record that.
And I must say, you think of big bureaucracy, there's only 50 career officials or so in OMB. We've got about 30 seconds, so I know the Federal Register, which contains all these rules and regs, is 90,000 pages. There's 300,000 employees, I guess, involved in this. Should that all be shrunken rather significantly? Can it be?
That certainly is one of President Trump's goals, is to shrink that.
Good way to end it then, because that's where we're going next. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find a station closest to you. Listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We'll look at President Trump's regulatory reform agenda, an ambitious one, as soon as we get back. We're back with former OIRA Administrator, Regulatory Czar Susan Dudley, now a professor at George Washington University. And I read, Trump has claimed that within his first 100 days, his regulatory reform has already produced $18 billion of savings. I don't know how you feel about that, but tell us how serious about regulatory reform he is, and start off with, I guess, after that, with the 1 in 2 out, what that means.
Okay. Yes, I've been studying regulation for a long time, and this presidential cycle, there has been more discussion of regulatory reform than I think I'd ever heard before. And President Trump in particular campaigned on cutting regulations. He made some quite dramatic claims about how much he would cut it, anywhere between 75% and 90% of regulations.
Wow.
What he has done in his first 100 days, and I can maybe just divide it into two categories. One is working with Congress. He has overturned 13 regulations that were issued at the end of President Obama's administration, using a statute that was passed in 1996 and only used once before. So, and we can talk about that more if you're interested. That's the Congressional Review Act. And then the second thing he's done is through executive orders, he has directed agencies to offset the cost of new regulations by looking at old regulations and removing them. So his executive order requires agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for every new one they issue, and to make sure that the total cost of those new regulations is no more than the total cost of the regulations that are getting removed.
So essentially he's capping increases in regulatory costs?
That's right.
Which is a pretty big deal.
It is a big deal. I actually think it is the most dramatic change in regulatory process since Ronald Reagan required agencies to submit regulations before they were issued to OIRA.
Let me ask you this. Does OIRA review executive orders, and would the immigration executive order have gone through OIRA, or should it have gone through for vetting?
OIRA does not review executive orders. Okay. Unless it's an executive order that is regulatory in nature. So I'm sure that they had a chance to look at these 2 regulatory, at his regulatory executive orders, but they would not have reviewed that one. They would not have seen that.
Okay. I guess Trump is also calling for regulatory reform officers and regulatory reform task forces. What does that mean? Yes,
that's the second kind of cross-cutting executive order that he issued. So in every agency, he's required somebody to be designated as the regulatory reform officer and a task force of other agency staff that would be the regulatory reform task force. This, I think, is interesting, and it seems more important to me than I thought when I initially saw it, in that agencies are filled, agencies have their mission, which is to find problems to address through regulation. So everyone in the agency is focused on finding the next, developing the next regulation. For the first time, there's going to be a group that is designated, that is responsible for looking at existing regulations, seeing if they actually work, and finding which ones might be modified or eliminated.
I find it interesting that President Trump, of course, is making all these claims for progress, but here's an area where it seems very significant that is getting no press even from him. Who is going to head OIRA, right? Because there's not a head in there right now, is there?
There's not. Well, there's an acting person, and the career staff at OIRA are just I just can't say enough good things about them. The OIRA administrator is a Senate-confirmed position, so the president has to nominate someone, and then the Senate needs to confirm them, as you would a judge or a department head. So he has announced his intention to nominate George Mason University law professor Naomi Rao. But her official nomination hasn't gone up, and of course she hasn't had her confirmation hearings and been confirmed yet.
What's her bent?
She's an administrative law professor, very well respected. She runs a center at George Mason Law School. It's actually now called the Antonin Scalia Law School, called Center for Study of the Administrative State. So she has a lot of experience, or she has a lot of academic knowledge. She also has worked in all three branches of government. She clerked for Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court. She worked on the Hill and was in the White House counsel's office in the Bush administration.
Interesting that you just went to Center for Administrative State. I was going to ask, Steve Bannon has talked about deconstruction of the administrative state. Is this what OIRA is going to be about, or?
They focus on the net benefits of the regulation. How can we issue regulation that provides the most good for the cost? So I think one thing that OIRA will be doing in this administration is providing that function. So while they will definitely be needing to work with the agencies, and they'll be coordinating the regulatory offset and the 2-for-1 executive orders, but I think they will be doing so in a way that recognizes which regulations continue to provide benefits and which ones perhaps have outlived their usefulness.
And I think you called for this, and you said it hasn't really been calculated, except maybe SBA. Should we have an accounting of the actual total compliance costs, its impact on the economy every year?
I actually think that's too hard to do.
Okay.
In part because some of these costs are just too hard to measure. So people have called for a full regulatory budget that is equivalent to the fiscal budget. And it sure would be valuable to have. I just don't think it can be done in a way that is principled or would even be as informative as the fiscal budget.
Okay, last question as we get down. Do you feel that there's regulatory overreach? That OIRA deals with that? And when there's a recommendation, for instance, to cut the EPA budget 30%, does somebody tie that back to how that would impact the regs and rules right now that are in there?
Well, that is one advantage of OIRA being part of the Office of Management and Budget, so that there is some coordination across the budget side of OMB and the regulatory side. I can't say what role they had in, how much OIRA was involved in that budget, the skinny budget that has come out. As you noted, it's a very small staff, and they not only have regulatory responsibility, but the chief statistician of the United States is part of OIRA, so all the statistical information goes through that office. So I don't know the extent that OIRA was involved in that.
Well, it's been a fascinating couple of segments, and you can see OIRA is actually a critical part of both the government and what looks like President Trump's strategies on the administrative state. Thanks to George Washington University Professor Susan Dudley. Her website is regulatorystudies.gwu and .edu. And Trump administration's regulatory actions can be found at reginfo.gov. That's reginfo.gov. Thanks to Susan Dudley. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell.